So welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Our webinar will start in a few seconds. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled in or silenced in universities, schools, and the media. Frustrated that we can't share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. And welcome. Thank you so much for coming. It's fine to chat and post lots of ideas into the chat and sort of continue the discussion in the chat, which is often a really great way to do it. So this week we have Heli Luce. Saint Luce. You've told me this so many times. I'll get it. Saint Luce. And Heli is has chosen Caliban and the Witch, or suggested that we talk about Caliban and the Witch by Sylvia Federici. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's just start off asking Heli, sort of chatting to Heli, why is it that you like this book? And then we'll go into explain about Sylvia. I'll tell you about Sylvia's Federici. Okay, so Heli, what's so good about the book?
It actually completely changed my life when I read it. It's one of the kind of foundational texts in terms of my whole healing and coaching practice. It gives such a clear insight into just a lot of the messes that we're in today. You know, it details really clearly the kind of training that has led to a lot of the political situations that women are in now, you know, and the fact that these are not our natural states, and that so much of what people take as obvious or, you know, just isn't, you know. I think it details, so like, just been dealing a lot of the, what is that word, the venom that women experience between each other, a lot of the competition, the fact that it seems sometimes so difficult to actually find true sisterhood, while it's something that most of us feel that we desire very much. And you can see that this has been systematically kind of embedded into our bodies historically. And also the violence that was used to embed the message of you are not safe with each other, has actually, you know, been ignored or denied in so much of history, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. So that's really good. Now, Heli, a couple of people in the chat, women in the chat, have said if you could speak a bit louder or possibly turn your mic volume up, which might be on your computer. Like, I sometimes find there's a sort of mic button and I have it on quite low, but otherwise just...
My mic is really quite as high as it goes.
Yes. So maybe just
run off. You do some talking and I will run off and get some headphones.
Okay, fine, great. Well, that's perfect. So what we're going to be doing anyway now is I'm going to just introduce the Sylvia Fedorici and give you some background about Sylvia Fedorici and the book. So Sylvia Fedorici is the author of Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. She was born in 1942. She's an Italian and American scholar, a teacher, activist from the radical autonomist, feminist, Marxist and anarchist tradition. So she doesn't say that she is a radical feminist, but many radical feminists, this series is called Radical Feminist Perspectives. Many of us radical feminists have found her work very interesting. And, you know, sometimes when you're reading her work, you would think she's very close. She has many insights that are very close, but she is more of, you know, Marxist and then in this anarchist tradition. It's also, she worked as a teacher in Nigeria for many years. And so she talks quite a lot about the situation in Nigeria, in Caliban and the Witch, and in her work. And right, so she was born in Italy. She moved to US for a PhD, to finish her PhD in 1967. And she ended up working in New York a lot. She's co-founder of the International Feminist Collective and was an organizer, or it says is an organizer, of the Wages for Housework campaign. So that was in the 1970s. And in 75, she published Wages Against Housework, which was the book most commonly associated with the Wages for Housework movement. So the idea that women do unpaid work. She's written a lot of books, so you can have a look and find them. And her most famous work is Caliban and the Witch, which we're going to be discussing today. She has also written recently, so last year, she wrote, I'm just going to get this up. Last year, she wrote, I need to get this, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. So this is 2020, which is, so it's very, very up to date. And if anybody's interested, it looks very interesting. I've been reading a bit of it, what she's saying in Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, and it sort of continues her ideas, which we'll discuss today, and then you'll get an idea. So Heli's not back yet, so I think Heli's, I'll get started a bit on telling you some of the stuff about Caliban and the Witch, and then Heli will come back. So this is the cover of the book, and you can see that it's called Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. Now, in my mind, if I sort of characterize what she's talking about and her perspective, she's coming from a Marxist perspective. So she sort of knew about when in the 70s, 60s, she knew the classic sort of Marxist, Engels, all the follow-on analysis of class and economic oppression. And then she talks about primitive accumulation. So that she's talking about how accumulation of energy and resources can, in the Marxist sense, comes and then can be taken from one person and used by another, sort of accumulation of capital. But she takes a really different perspective to the Marxists. So she sort of blows that out of the water in a very interesting way, taking the feminist perspective. Great, Heli's back. So I've just sort of basically read the introduction on Sylvia Federici and explained a little bit about the background. I can see in the chat there's a couple of stuff, there's criticisms and sort of points about Federici, which I'll just deal with and then come back to you. Is she set up the Wages for Housework campaign, and the Wages for Housework campaign is associated with the English Collective of Prostitutes. And the English Collective of Prostitutes are pro-prostitution, and she does still call it sex work. She is not vehemently involved. She doesn't seem to be very active in this area, and she doesn't talk about prostitution, but she hasn't changed her position on it. So that's a sort of difference between radical feminists and Sylvia Federici. But on much of the analysis of the oppression of women and the systems of oppression and the body and witchcraft and colonialism, she is similar to us, and it's very interesting. And I'll just say that having read the stuff she wrote last year, she's getting into masses of trouble for being gender critical or against the trans movement. And so most of the reviews of her book, last year's book, are saying how terrible she is, because they don't call her a TERF, but they basically are saying she's completely wrong on she doesn't really recognize transgender ideology as valid. So that's encouraging. Okay, so Heli, yeah, so let's
she's definitely identifies herself as a Marxist feminist. I don't. What I really like about this is that she actually kind of shreds a lot of Marx's arguments in this book. So even though that is the perspective from which she's coming, she really highlights the flaws in his thinking, and you know, just like all of the great so-called great thinkers of the what do you call it, the Age of Enlightenment, I think they called it. What I did was I went through through YouTube, and there's a lot of dissections of this book. It's really very it's quite a seminal book for a lot of people, I think. Thinking a book is fantastic doesn't necessarily mean that you think that the author is fantastic, I think, you know, but what she says in this book, it's one of the books that I think every woman should read. So she's not a radical feminist, but there's so much in this book that is similar to radical feminist writing. So for instance, it's very academic, but it's also amazingly easy to read. You know, she does make telling you the most horrific facts. It's easy to get through, but it's really dense, and the writing is tiny. So I know that there's lots and lots of women, definitely my daughter would have difficulty even being able to read it because of the way that it's printed. And there's a lot of discussions of the content and what she's actually saying on the internet. And I made a kind of a cheat sheet, because one of the other things about this book is that the introduction is an amazing resource of writing that really changed the way that radical, that's what's amazing about this book. Writing this book actually changed a lot of radical feminist thought. And she explains how in the beginning, so her premise of, I started writing it because these were the arguments that were being posited at the time. And this is where they both left out. So particularly in radical feminism, there was a lot of theoretical, what was it? I can't remember if I wrote it down. So what is it? Where is it? I found it between the then currently prevailing theoretical and political perspectives of radical versus socialist feminism. So when you read those in the introduction, it's very clear for me then, coming in at the end, towards the end of the second wave, that a lot of what is in this book actually changed radical feminist perspective, because a lot of what I was kind of taught with the basics are what her book actually put into play. Like there was the historical oppression of women and how you can trace that from religion into the laws that were enacted, into the social uprisings that were going on at the beginning of when she starts the book in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I mean, I'll read a bit on page 14 of my copy of the book. This is in her introduction, which if you don't want to read the whole thing, just read the introduction. It's brilliant. She says, the important historical question addressed by the book is how to account for the execution of hundreds of thousands of witches at the beginning of the modern era, and how to explain why the rise of capitalism was co-evil. I don't know how to spell it, maybe it's coeval, but it's C-O-E-V-A.
Coeval, I think it is.
Okay, with a war against women. So the great thing is, if you've read Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy, or you saw our webinar on that she was really talking about the ancient periods when there were the Greeks and the Romans and in Mesopotamia. She was talking about that as the creation of patriarchy, that sort of to 3000 BC to 2000 BC, those sort of times. Now, this book by Sylvia Fedorici is from about 1300 to 1800, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which many of us have read loads about, sort of Christopher Hill and people like that. The sort of the working class being created, the formation of a proletariat, the ruling class getting rid of the old landed aristocracy. She completely transforms our understanding of what actually happened, how that transition from what was called, well, from feudalism to capitalism happened. And she said it's quite complicated how she says it, but she says that one of the main mechanisms to enable that to happen was to make women the site of primitive accumulation, the first bit of exploitation that happens, and to push women out of the paid labor force by accusing lots of women of being witches, and also break women's sort of control over their own bodies, most importantly in terms of women being midwives and excluding men from the birthing process. But there are various other things. So for me, it was like, wow, I can actually understand this period. And she sort of says, like, why didn't Marx or Engels talk about witchcraft? It was a big thing.
Foucault or
Yeah.
Foucault.
Yes,
you know?
yeah. He does
So,
like Foucault.
Yeah, so one of the things that I like, the book actually, what's really great about it is that it comes from, she says that it accompanied the development of the feminist movement in the United States concerning the debate about the roots of women's oppression. And that, there was just a massive disagreement from the socialist feminists and radical feminists of where this came from. So it really does chart in minute detail the journey from feudalism to capitalism, and she actually demonstrates quite clearly that people were better off, individuals were better off under feudalism than they've ever managed to be under capitalism. Not that she says that feudalism was great, and what happened was that this whole attack on the proletariat came about from their rebellions against the feudal state.
And also, I mean, she was saying that capitalism, her reading of it is that capitalism was a response to the revolutionary potential of the serfs and the peasants, who were forming quite a good, they were communes, or they had communities, and they were demanding to work less and to share the benefit of higher productivity. And the capitalists formed an alliance with some of the old aristocracy in order to sort of crush the potential for a better world. So that's really different from Marx, who she says she thought, Marx was saying capitalism was progress, and then the next thing would be socialism, whatever, whereas she was just saying, actually, capitalism was a counter-revolution to the progress that would have happened coming out of feudalism, which is so interesting.
So one of the things that it's based on is that, the period is round about just after the Black Death. So my understanding of it historically is that, again, as seems to be the case with COVID-19, men had a much higher rate of death from the plague than women did. So at the end of the plague years, there was a huge disproportionate of many more women than boys. So because there's more boys born, but more of them tend to die in the when they're very, very young than baby girls. So there's those two factors. So at the end of the plague years, there were just huge numbers of women. So 50, 60 years later, women have loads of property. Much more probably than any other time. They're doing lots of jobs that are technically being reserved for men. So women are actually moving into the mercantile class. And that's the other thing that's, I think has been detailed in other feminist works, that, the whole witch burnings were a huge money-making enterprise. So apart from the poor women who were carted off, a lot of the women were actually, they're mercantile. They were women with money. So they had to pay for every single stage of their witch burning if they had the money. They paid for the person who tried them. They paid for the instruments that they were tortured with. They paid for the people who tried against them, and all of their property was then taken. So the witch burning years, as well as kind of subjugating women, also really stripped the ones who had assets of all of their assets.
Yeah, and then she talks now in her recent book, the last year's book, about the link between big pharmaceutical capitalism and transgender ideology, and how it's a money-making opportunity. When you read her recent book, you think very much of Jennifer Billick in terms of that it's capitalism analysis, and they're quite close. I think, well, when I read it, it seems quite similar in the analysis. I mean, just a point on that, I love this book, but I do think that she says that the cause of all the cause of sexism and the cause of women's oppression is capitalism, and it's the capitalist class, and she very seldom mentions any agency or choice by working class men or any oppressed men. It's a tool. Sexism is a tool given by capitalism, or it really comes from the ruling class, the rich. And I think she does mention a couple of times that she thinks that the poorer men were manipulated, and so they were also, she says really that
she makes one really,
given
really clear point.
To be sexist.
She says really clearly, but it's a couple of lines. And what she says is that the only place that there was any resistance ever seen to the witch burnings was in Baskerland. That I think that, she puts things very, very subtly, and a lot of the things that I pull out of it are actually unstated, but I think kind of implicit in what she says. Yeah.
And so, that's when there were some sailors went off and they were sailing and they were catching cod, and they were meant to be gone for 3 months, was it? And then they heard that most of their daughters, loads of their daughters and wives were just about to be burnt, and so they came back early and put a stop to it. And as a group of men, a male group, a class, and so she said that if other groups of men had done that, it would never have happened. So I think she does. I think so. Yeah, you're right. She does talk about men's complicity, but she really blames the ruling class, as far as I can see.
And I think in terms of the evidence that she presents, that's a really valid claim. And I also like the fact that she really does take on board the fact that the witch burnings were exported to the New Worlds, to Africa and to the Americas, and also used as part of their kind of subjugation of the indigenous peoples. So I think she really brings that into play, which I really thought was, it's often missing in European explorations, that you can see really, really clearly that that it's whatever the British did anywhere in the world, they did in the UK first. And also what I think it's also quite subtle is how she says that the ruling classes kind of co-opted the working classes into the oppression of the people who were actually their allies with tea and sugar and coffee. It's like what will cause people to lose their humanity is an addiction to something.
Yeah. And a great thing. I mean, I remember the first time.
I don't think so, Sheila. I don't think she did romance. That's not how I read it. What I read is that she won't openly state that they were complicit in the oppression of women, but she does continuously say that men profited from every time she describes something that was being done to women. She makes it clear that men in general did not defend or protect women in any way during what was happening, and that they actually profited from it. I think that's said quite clearly a number of times, that men exploited what was happening to women.
I think it's also, I mean, when I read it, I think it's almost as if she's making a political program or a proposition to say, look, left-wing men, our interests, this destruction of our communities was done by the ruling class, and it's in everybody's interest to fight it. And it's quite optimistic in that you think, well, if she's right, if her analysis is right, then it's in everybody's interest. But there are many bits of evidence that say working class men and oppressed men don't see it that way, and they haven't joined ranks with women they just haven't done it. And I think her argument is that they've just been brainwashed, and they should throw off the oppression of thinking they need to be sexist. But yeah.
I mean, my conclusion from the book is really, really controversial. I was a bit late because I was arguing with my partner about it. So before I say this and people start accusing me of being a baby murderer, like my work shows that it is possible to tilt the sex of a baby, if you insist on having sex with men, but you can tilt the sex of a baby to make, and it's much easier to make the vagina more receptive to having girls than boys. And at the time that you choose to, if you have sex before you ovulate rather than when you ovulate or just after, you're also more likely to have girls. So I think this book is, what did I write? The clearest plight for separatism, political lesbianism, and reducing the number of boy children until we can completely change the current mode of thinking. You know, yeah, because that women have to turn to that which is used against us for it to work for us. So I'm not saying abort baby boys. I'm saying you don't have to have as many of them, you know? And that's what I read in this book. So I don't care if she's a radical feminist or not. It just made me start thinking about it and doing loads and loads of research. When, you know, that's what I think the book is saying. That's what I read into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting because when you read it, if you read it, as with lots of fantastic books, lots of ideas and parallels and analogies of what's happening today come up. It's so relevant to the system, the witchcraft. So much of what she's talking about are the witch trials, and what she said is she thinks it was a sort of like cobbled together illogical system or ideology, but it functioned to help the development of capitalism and to put women into sort of the home, into this unpaid labor, and into this natural state, the nature, to create a new type of woman. And she says that this was used as in the transition to get women from being part of these feudal communities where they had reasonable amounts of power, and in the guilds before the witch crazes, there were, she says, something like 50 out of 70 of the guilds had women in them, in significant positions, in significant numbers, and then that all changed, and that there were this period of about 250 years of transition where the role of women as a class, well, she didn't say, I think she does call us a class, she changed, and then they didn't need witchcraft anymore, so they just forgot about it. And also there's a really good bit where she says that some of the philosophers of the time in the 17th century, they explicitly said they didn't believe in any of the ideas of witchcraft, but they thought they were very, very useful in order to transform society. So that's great. Yeah.
And the book deals with kind of like three main areas, you know, and she says that Marxism's account of capitalist accumulation completely excludes women, which invalidates it. She says that domestic labor, including the bearing of children, is central or foundational to the perpetuation of capitalism, and that femalization of tasks was like was a social construction, and she traces the process. And she also just talks about how capitalism works by division. So there's three main areas that she explores in that. So that's the mechanization of the body. So before the body was seen as a magical space, and magic was seen as a part of life. So they turned the body from this magical series of processes into a vehicle, into just a machine. And she also talks about, yes, the theft of all of the common lands. I made the sheet that I said I'd sent to you. So on there is just basically a list of all the books that she mentions in the introduction. When I first read the book, the only one I'd read was Sex, Race and Class by Selma James, which was also, I think it's a seminal sort of feminist book. There's 3 YouTube videos. The first one is her talking for 8 minutes, but I'd hoped we could show some of that. I don't know if we can, but what I love about it is that in the 8 minutes, it takes her 4.5 minutes or something to explain what she means when she uses the word feminism, which is so, I thought was, because it was taken a couple of years ago, and this is the state that we're in now, where she has to say, like, when I say feminism, I don't mean this, and I don't mean this, and I don't mean this, and I mean this, and I mean, so yeah.
Yeah, I'll cut and paste that and put that whole document and put it in the chat, and then hopefully women can pick that out. There's a bit that I found very nice. I'm going to read it from the introduction. Now she's criticizing postmodernist academics and saying that they're questioning the relevance of using the word woman. And this is when she first wrote the book, 2004, she writes this. Well, actually, she might have, she edited it in 2014. So possibly she added this bit, but anyway, it's in here in the introduction. It says, to rephrase the point I already made, if femininity has been, so this is her criticism of all the postmodernists. If femininity has been constructed in capitalist society as work function, masking the production of the workforce under the cover of a biological destiny, then women's history is class history. And the question that has to be asked is whether the sexual division of labor that has produced that particular concept has been transcended. If the answer is a negative one, as it must be when we consider the present organization of reproductive labor, then women is a legitimate category of analysis, and activities associated with reproduction remain a crucial ground of struggle for women, as they were for the feminist movement of the 1970s, which on this basis is connected itself with the history of witches. So she's definitely on the side with the radical feminists of believing that women, the category of woman is based in the body, and it's based in reproduction, and it's a legitimate area of analysis. So while she's coming from a slightly different angle, it's definitely interesting reading her analysis and her sort of commitment to using the word woman as we know it.
And also there's one section where she talks a lot about how prostitution was instituted by the church as a weapon against women. And that the first brothels were pretty much state and church run.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So yes, this is a bit that I thought was interesting. As Heli says, they talk about the Black Death in Britain and, well, in Europe. The Black Death killed off probably 1/3 of the population, and the labor force, the feudal serfs, had a lot more power, so they could demand better conditions, either better conditions where they were living from the lord who owned the land, or more access to the common land, because there was a lot of common land, or wages, and they could just run away to the cities. And she says that there was this crisis in organization of society, because the poor, which was, the masses, almost everybody, not the owners of the landlords, were demanding better rights and better conditions, and they had the power to do that. And then she says, however, by the end of the 15th century, so that's like 1490 or something, a counter-revolution was already underway at every level of social and political life. First efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex and turned class antagonism into an antagonism against proletarian women. So so she's saying that the sort of changes were driven by the capitalist ruling class, and they were but the youngest and most rebellious male workers were co-opted, and she does imply that they wanted to do it. So that was bad.
I think some of the headings in the book, because when you read the she's just got all of these really quite short headings, so they're almost like lots and lots of short essays. So when she's talking about the accumulation of labor and degradation of women, so then you can just open it, and then you've got like the devaluation of women's labor, followed by women, the new commons, and the substitute for the lost land, then the patriarchy of the wage, the taming of women, and the redefinition of femininity and masculinity, women, the savages of Europe. So, you know, just going through and reading the headings is just mind-boggling, you know, the concepts that she puts forward.
Yeah. And what can you tell us what why you about why Federici called it Caliban and the Witch?
Well, it's from The Tempest. Caliban is from The Tempest. So if you don't know the story, basically, you know, it's about a bloke who colonizes an island and harnesses with his superior Western magic the nature magic of the island, which is embodied in a witch who's been murdered and his making of her son Caliban into a slave. So the whole of the Tempest is kind of an analogy of what happens in the fight with women. So the way that I can't remember, Prospero colonized Caliban and his space, and the way that that is used as a function within the play represents what happened to the body of the working classes, but that what happened to the body of the working classes was played out specifically in the body of women by inventing this notion of a witch as something evil.
Yeah, it really brilliantly summarizes her scope of how she's looking at the medieval period, and then she's looking at the transition from feudalism to capitalism and the transition of who we are as people and how we get privatized. So the commons were being privatized and enclosed at that time, and then we as women were being made into a sort of state of nature, that was exploitable. And then a lovely thing I really like about the book is that because Sylvia Fedorici is Italian originally, and she has really strong links with Italy, she's written books in Italian, she works with Italian scholars, but she's also European in that broader sense of knowing and reading about the European history. Caliban and the Witch covers the whole of Europe, unlike quite often, if you read something written by an Anglo-Saxon, sort of British or American Anglophone, they only deal with what happened in Essex or somewhere in Britain, England. But she covers the whole of Europe, which is really, really interesting. And then she expands over to Africa and the Caribbean during the slave trade. And then at the end, well, in fact, she brings it up all the way through, but she talks about her experiences in Nigeria in the 1990s, at the time of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund instituted structural adjustment programs. And she makes a really convincing and very clear link between that capitalism at that time in the 1990s was globalizing, and they were unhappy with the communities that still had a lot of common land and the lack of work ethic. They were just different, had different communities and different ways of being. Like if somebody made a lot of money in Nigeria, they would share it with their family and all their friends and their community. And that wasn't great for accumulating capital and sucking money out of Nigeria and Africa. And she talks about how the structural adjustment was in the 90s, and that, you know, it's still carrying on now.
I've
Was
got
very
the quote
similar.
for it.
Yeah.
So it says the structural adjustment program, the World Bank's universal recipe for economic recovery, the declared purpose was to make Nigeria competitive on the international market, but it was soon apparent that this involves a new round of primitive accumulation and rationalization of social reproduction aimed at destroying the last vestiges of communal property and community relations, and thereby impose more intense forms of labor exploitation. And she said she witnessed the fueling of a misogynist campaign denouncing women's vanity and excessive demands.
Yeah. And then she talks about how in areas where there are more enclosures, that's where common lands, like say the forests or some fields, where if you've got some sheep, you could go and graze them on the land, or fields, or you could go to the forest and gather berries or something. Where there's enclosure, so that land becomes privatized and the community can't get sustenance from that land, there's more witchcraft. And that she sort of shows that in her analysis of British witchcraft, that in some areas where there are a lot of enclosures, massive amounts of witchcraft, witch trials, and then in the other areas where there weren't so many enclosures, there were barely any. And then she links that up to Africa today, that she knows about this. South Africa and Nigeria, she particularly talks about, and I think Brazil as well. There's a lot of accusations, and then Brazil, there's a lot of enclosure of the Amazon rainforest and other lands, those sort of trying to privatize and stop communities owning bits of land. So she's very involved in that now as well, isn't she? That resistance to enclosures.
Yeah, not that it helps very much. Yeah. I mean, resist. It's almost a bit like, it's the Borg, isn't it? Resistance is futile. What I really take from the book is that it's about that when you have a clearer understanding of the history, then you have a better space in which to make changes, I think, and it becomes really clear that a lot of the changes that need to occur have to happen in our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with each other and our relationships with nature.
Yeah. In the last bit, her recent 2020 book, her last essay is about it's something about how we see the body and the sort of how we see ourselves, and I think it was a real insight for me, because she was sort of saying we don't need to just see ourselves as machines to be exploited. We don't have to sort of see how we can sell ourselves. We can see ourselves as part of communities, and also part of nature, sort of linked up to trees and nature. So she gets sort of a bit hippie-ish. I don't know if that's the right word, but I actually think
that's
liberating.
Where she gets me. Yeah, I mean, I think she's the basis for so much, and it's such a kind of an academic, scientific-y kind of book, with so many references, that it's kind of, my friend says, it's a bit weird that I can read this book and then it's, it becomes the basis of what my daughter calls my spiri-wiri work, because I think that it is a call for us to see ourselves as magical once again, and to really try and adopt that medieval view of the body as this incredible space where everything can occur, where everything is possible. That magic is kind of like thought slowed down, is the way that I see it. So I think we should regard ourselves much more as magical and as sacred,
Yeah.
as women, you know, as the basis for moving forward.
And I suppose what I see, I mean, apart from I think the analysis is really interesting, is, I mean, this is ironic. I just got myself a watch because she says when we became proper workers, we had to be on time for things. And that's one of the things about us being sort of seeing our lives
Mechanized.
as controlled and linked up to machines. And that is one of the problems with some societies. They say, oh, everyone has to turn up at 7 a.m. and nobody does. And then I thought, oh, actually, I never do. Well, I do turn up on time, but it would be quite useful to have a watch. But I found it's very interesting that we can, I like her stuff about the commons, about working with others in our community. I mean, the community of choice for me is the sort of lesbian radical feminist community. So, but working together, joined up, where it stops us being just like these machines, these exploited machines. And that's sort of like how I just get the feeling that is what is great if we work together. So a bit like sisterhood is powerful. And so she doesn't use that term, but she's so embedded in the feminist movement.
Yes. Yeah. And I really like that, you know, also she talks about the fact that this book, you know, was created by what can only have been really robust discussions and disagreements. And it really highlights how kind of like mealy-mouthed and pussyfooty we are at the moment very often when we're engaging with other women, and that we, you know, that I don't think, you know, the books that we're creating now, like nowadays, if women have a gift, you know, they shared their ideas, and now people want to either monetize or academicize their ideas, you know, rather than just giving them freely and exchanging them for criticism, you know, in a woman's space. And of course, the loss of women's spaces over the last, or its appreciation, indeed, Georgia, over the last few years has really been a crippling of the women's movement, and that we just need to find more spaces where we can be together, and better ways to be able to argue with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and Heli, when we were discussing this book, thinking about doing this book, there were a couple of other books you were saying you really like. Could you tell us a bit about the other books, if you can, if it's possible?
Well, one of them that I was going to say that was again, you know, really shaped my thinking as a young woman, was The War Against Women. I think it's Marilyn French,
Yeah,
which
I don't know.
I've had like at least 3 copies that were never given back, and I can't find it anymore. But that, I think, is an amazing book. You know, and most of these, but the difficulty was that I think a lot of these women, like Sylvia Federici, I don't know if they're radical feminists. I don't think so. So The War Against Women, but also When God Was a Woman, which, you know, it covers similar ground, so parallel work in lots of ways to the Gerda Lerner's the Birth of Patriarchy,
Yeah.
and also The Chalice and the Blade. So I think The Chalice and the Blade, When God Was a Woman, and The War Against Women, I read those when I was in my early teens, and they just blew my mind. And yeah, just that, yeah, I don't know. They just changed.
How about in terms of radical feminism, what is it that makes you a radical feminist, or if you are, rather than a socialist feminist?
Well, because I do, well, radical terms of being the roots. And if you really accept that women are an oppressed class and you want to go to the roots of it, it's really clearly that the roots of that is the patriarchy, and that anything that profits men, including me and my wonderful partner, you know, is only adding to our own oppression. I really do subscribe to the notion of feminism, the theory, lesbianism, the practice. Obviously, you know, on a practical level, that doesn't work for bisexual and heterosexual women in lots of ways. But what am I? I am definitely a radical feminist. I just think, you know, yeah, prostitution is wrong and there's no excuse for it. I think the vast majority of heterosexual sex that takes part is actually rape, and women are just not prepared to own it. And I do feel very culpable and collusional in my relationship with a man. However, you know, we've been so divided and separated from each other structurally that there aren't any spaces, really safe spaces, for women to align anymore and to be together. So yeah, does that make me a radical feminist? You know, I'm not at all an academic. You know, I really have an issue with academia. You know, I think it takes everyday ideas and just like turns them into shit that you know, that just piles up on us in general. However, then I read, you know, books that are by radical academic feminists, and they're just like, they're readable. They're about the only nonfiction that I do read.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
so I think like Sylvia Fedorici, she's been involved in activism for all of her life, and it makes it, she makes it more sort of relevant to me. I even though she is an academic, I think it's sort of easier to read. But the ones who are just pure academics, I just feel like they're completely out of touch. Like there was the RadFem conference a couple of years ago, and some women from just pure academia turned up, quite young women, and they'd say, oh, well, I've been studying all of this. I'm doing a master's on women's resistance to, say, like sex-based rights, let's say, and or to surrogacy. And we found that there are no organizations doing anything on this. And it's because all she reads is the academic peer-reviewed literature, which silence us, which is sort of why we're doing these webinars. So she didn't have any idea. And I just went on the internet and said, oh, well, there's all these ones. And also on our Women's Declaration, or our signatory organizations, loads of them are activists against surrogacy. And she sort of said, oh, okay. But it was as if she wasn't listening. She won't, loads of academic so-called feminists or feminists don't engage with activism, which just means that it just seems like it's irrelevant. And
I mean, I think if you like, part of the radical is being active, and that doesn't necessarily mean being out on the streets, but it does mean being vocal. You share either your activism or your ideas. I think that's the basis of being, you know, it's exchange, and it's about uplifting, supporting each other, you know. Also that whole idea that if I'm magical, then every other woman is magical too. And that there's a different kind of balancing that needs to happen in our exchanges. And we need to be woman-centered and woman-focused.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I don't know, Heli, did you find anything in the chat that you think we should?
It's gone past so quickly. There were a couple of things. So one was, yes, it is to do with alkaline. So if you make the vagina slightly more acidic before sperm goes into it, then you're more likely to have a girl child.
Well, I've got 2 girl children, so maybe I did that without knowing it. And no males.
Yeah, you know, we called it the girl club. We called it the girl club, and only women who only had girls were allowed in. Because there is, again, you think about something like Adrienne Rich's a book of Woman Born, where you see that women really do treat boy and girl children differently. And I think it's in that book that she discovered, you know, through lots of research, that women start underfeeding their girls from a really young age, because they know that if they eat enough, they're not going to be slim enough to pass as attractive in male society. So it was just this whole thing about women, not even consciously, you know, underfeeding their girls as a way of protecting them. Yeah, you know, and you know, most women with sons are always going on about, oh, he's so vulnerable, or, you know, they have this kind of weird protective idea about boys, apparently because they tend to be born smaller and weaker. they're just treated so very, very differently.
Yeah. Well, look, I've just posted in the what we're going to have next week, which we're going to have Marion Ritigliano and Julia Long talking about Going Out of Our Minds by Sonia Johnson. I just want to read another bit that I found in this. This is nearer to the end. So this is interesting about it. Well, I'll just say that one of the things that Federici does is she said that she thought radical feminists were a bit ahistorical because they just said patriarchy has been going on forever and it isn't part of a historical process. So she wanted to, in this book, put patriarchy into a historical perspective, sort of say, or into a historical situation. And I suppose feeling that if that was done, then you could break free of it. And I don't think it's really fair of her to say that we radical feminists think that patriarchy, we are ahistorical about it. I think that was wrong of her to say that we would simplistically saying that. But anyway,
I think that she said that that's what she said, that that's the arguments that were happening at the time that she started. They were those arguments that were happening were why she started writing the book. Can I just answer the question?
Yeah.
If there's one question. So why are the witch hunts relevant now? So you have to understand that every single woman born in Europe comes from a line of people who spent, to put it quickly, like 200 years, which is roughly 6 generations of girls watching their aunties, their grandmothers, and their mothers burn. Now, what does that do to your psyche when you know that the only thing your grandmother or mother did was be female, and you're watching them, you know, subjected to, and not just them, but women all around you across the whole of Europe? That history, we know that things that happen generationally become part of your genetic pattern. So that's why the witch hunts are important now, because there is and remember, they were taken to the Americas. So you're talking 200 years of continual brutal subjugation of any woman who steps out of line. So that fear is embedded in all European women's bodies, all African women's bodies, you know, all colonized women's bodies.
Yeah, and this relates to what you've just said, Heli. So this is on page 170. It says, witch hunting was instrumental in the construction of a new patriarchal order where women's bodies, their labor, their sexual and reproductive powers were placed under the control of the state and transformed into economic resources. This means that the witch hunters were less interested in the punishment of any specific transgressions than in the elimination of generalized forms of female behavior, which they no longer tolerated and had to be made abominable in the eyes of the population. It's very relevant today.
Yes, exactly. It is very, without having gone into the tea issue. It's happening now. Women are literally being burnt for just telling the truth, and believing in biological fact.
Yeah, and because we don't really own the means of production these days, because we're all dispossessed and we only have our labor and our bodies, I think that rather than being kicked off the land or made into a resource, we're being kicked out of jobs, which are our desperate, the place you can get some resources. So it's it's different, but in my mind, the sort of function is anybody who doesn't submit won't be allowed access to wages. That's,
and Layla said 2 women were burnt in the UK this month, so they were set on fire. So that sounds to me again like honor killings, So if you look at the rates of female mutilation that are happening in European countries, and then next to that, you've got women going and having vaginoplasty to try and, make their vaginas look like porn stars. You know, there's just, our minds have been colonized, and that mechanization has separated us from the how do you say that, the sacredness of our bodies. You know, in the chat, I remember one time there was somebody who said forcing women to have vaginal birth is oppressive. That was in one of the Saturdays when we were talking about birth, you know, having been colonized, and she was like, you know, all for elective cesareans, and you know, just that whole notion of just that she places really clearly how, you know, the midwives were targeted, so that whole area of safety, of women birthing other women's bodies, is handed over to men who just made it. And as that was happening, more and more babies started dying, but the babies dying was blamed on the witches rather than on the fact that the people who had the knowledge for childbearing were being murdered. It was like witches killing babies and eating babies, as opposed to inept men trashing women's bodies and killing babies.
Right, fantastic. So we've come to the end. It's 11:02, so we're late. We should be finishing. So thank you so much, Heli, and it just incredibly interesting. And thank you to everybody who's come. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion, and as part of a process, I think we're doing really well. There's over 80, well, there's 81 of us here, and it means there's a space for us to discuss. And I mean, I certainly don't feel that confident about talking about this, but we've done our best, and it's created a space where it's brought us together to discuss. And I'm sure loads of women in the chat know more than me certainly about this, but we're getting there. We're having a time when we come together to do this. So we'll carry on. If you have any books you're interested in, let us know, and we'll keep going. And Heli, the books that you've suggested, hopefully you'll come back and talk about them. I haven't read either of them, so we'll get somebody else to discuss them with you. But
thank you so much for inviting me, Joan. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant.
And thank you everybody who came in.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Okay, we'll see you next week. So we've got Marian Rutuliano and Julia Long next week, talking at the Sonia Johnson book. So great if anybody, if you can all come to that. Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.